What you call that noise?
The XTC Podcast.
XTCLimeWire.com.
What do you call that noise?
What do you call that noise?
And then he would take off all his clothes apart from his underpants, which he would then hitch up round his bottom and be a sumo wrestler and dance around the studio. There was never a dull moment in the studio.
That was Hugh Padgham remembering the antics of Andy Partridge when he was recording with XTC at the Manor. It is part of this episode's interview with the engineer and producer who talked on stage about everything from Brian Wilson to English settlement when I interviewed him at the XTC Fan Festival in Swindon in June 2025. Hello, I'm Mark Fisher and this is What Do You Call That Noise, the XTC Podcast. And that's not where the excitement ends. I'm delighted to say that the podcast has attracted its first sponsor, and I'm even more delighted to say that it is Burning Shed, the official online store for all your XTC needs. After high-level negotiations in the back of the Mecca during the Fan Festival, the online record shop has very kindly agreed to support the podcast for the next year. You can sign up for their weekly newsletter at burningshed.com. And if you go to that website, you'll also find goodies from loads of artists, including Big Big Train, Circa 5, Mike Keneally, Shriekback and Stephen Wilson. It is the only place to get official XTC merchandise. They ship worldwide and proceeds go to the band. Burning Shed is run by Pete Morgan and Tim Bourne, both of them musicians and both of them big fans of XTC. And you can hear, in fact, Tim talking about Mummer in the May 2022 episode of What Do You Call That Noise. They took over running the Ape store in 2011 and have fond memories of visiting Andy Partridge's famous garden shed, where he played them the intro to Love on a Farm Boy's Wages on the acoustic guitar he used on the track. Pete emailed me to say, "We really enjoyed the XTC Fan Festival and would like to thank everyone who came to say hello and bought something from the stall. We had no idea what to expect and were overwhelmed by everyone's enthusiasm and support." And if you're checking out Burning Shed, you might want to have a look at Stephen Wilson's latest remix, which is a Atmos version of Drums and Wires. Coming up in just a moment is a review by Jonathan Jacques, who grabbed himself an early copy and put it through its multi-speaker paces. But first, let's have a listen to the music you have been making that shows the influence of XTC in some way. This time, it is the turn of Mick Marston of the Minor Ailments, who joins us to explain the thinking behind You Block Out the Sun.
What do you call that noise?
Hi Mark, thank you for your generosity in offering to listen to XTC-inspired songs by XTC fans. I'm nearly 60 and have been a fan of XTC since I heard This Is Pop many moons ago. After spending a few years in bands as a teenager in my early 20s, I packed in music to pursue other creative endeavours. I picked up a guitar again 3 years ago with the intention of learning to write a song. I suppose we never escape our tastes and influences, and what comes out, which brings me to the track You Block Out the Sun. It was initially recorded as a straight-up rock song, but I was unsatisfied with it and was searching for something else. By a happy accident, via the Chalk Hills Facebook site, I came across XTC Play at Home, first broadcast in 1984, which was a promo film of Beating of Hearts from Mummer. Instantly mesmerised, I knew my song needed some Eastern flavour. The riff came from a B-E guitar tuning, and collaborator Phil Jones added the tabla-style drums and sprinkled it with Eastern Promise. I think it may have probably ended up somewhere nearer the Garden of Earthly Delights in retrospect due to the quicker tempo, but Beating of Hearts was definitely the catalyst. Here was the Minor Ailments and You Block Out the Sun. I hope you like it.
Side wrong, baby, better stay in your shed. Your skin is so red, big head, what have you been fed? Be careful where you tread, what was that you just said? Bamboozled by a leg break, better give your head a shake. Don't step on that rake, cheer up, better put your face straight before the wind change, before it's too late. You block out the sun. You're the cut that got my my shin bone wheel and fortune crush my iPhone working. Never been gone a long time. Black cat fell down coal mine. Black dog, he came back home looking like a bag of bones. Where the hell did you roam? Keep your chin, cause it might never happen. Listen to the sound of one hand clapping. You block out the sun. You're the cat that got my tongue. You bring torrential rain. You're the soul against my brain. You power the weight. You're the lock upon my gate. You're the persistent stain. You're the fat smelling the drain.
What do you call that noise?
Thank you, Mick. You can hear more from the Minor Ailments at their Bandcamp page, and I'll include a link with the podcast blurb. And if you have an XTC-inspired song that you'd like to have the world to hear, do let me know. Just email me at mark@xtclimelight.com. Many thanks to the fantastic people who have signed up to Patreon to keep the podcast on the road. If you've enjoyed what you've heard, it'd be great if you consider joining them. All you have to do is go to patreon.com/Mark Fisher and decide on your level of support. There are 3 levels. And if you opt to be a knight in shining karma, I'll read out your name at the end of each episode. Before the podcast, there was a book. What Do You Call That Noise? An XTC Discovery book, which offers a musician's eye view of the band. You can buy it at xtclimelight.com, where you can also find details of all these podcasts. I'm going to hand over now to Jonathan Jacques to give us the lowdown on the latest remix of Drums and Wires. And coming straight after that, it's the wonderful Hugh Padgham at the 2025 XTC Fan Festival.
What do you call that noise?
I'm thrilled to be able to share my thoughts with you on Stephen Wilson's brand new 2025 mix of XTC's classic Drums and Wires album, which uses immersive Dolby Atmos surround sound technology to enhance your listening pleasure. My intention is to compare this with Stephen's previous 2014 5.1 mix and to address the question whether it's worth shelling out of your hard-earned for a new copy if you're lucky enough to have the ability to enjoy the Blu-ray in Atmos. A thank you and a couple of caveats before I get into my stride. Firstly, huge thanks to Hick Sasaki of Panegyric for rushing a copy of the new release over so I could record this to fit in alongside the same podcast as Mark's interview with the album's engineer Hugh Padgham at the Fan Festival. Secondly, I want to acknowledge that this review is based on listening to the Blu-ray on my relatively basic home 7.1.4 system, which uses up-firing speakers for the height channels. Comparing this to hearing it on the phenomenal 16.1.20 system at L Acoustics, which I've previously been lucky enough to provide reviews for the Big Express and Skylarking Atmos mixes, is a bit like comparing Baby Sham with Bollinger. My understanding is that there wasn't a launch event for Drums and Wires at L Acoustics, as Stephen is away touring his excellent The Overview album in North America. Lastly, given the turnaround required, I'm going to be sharing pretty much my first impressions of the new mix. I've given a few tracks from the 2014 5.1 mix a head-to-head comparison listen, but this is far from a forensic analysis between the two. So apologies up front if I've missed anything. So, what do you reckon, John? Is it worth heading over to see our friends at burningshed.com? If you can play the album in Atmos, then in a heartbeat, I'd say yes. In my opinion, the 2025 Atmos mix is a definite and qualitative upgrade on the 5.1 mix, largely because the huge amount of extra space available on this soundstage has enabled significantly more definition of the sounds of the instruments and on the vocals of this album. It's not like the Big Express, where so many of the multi-tracks have been compacted and buried into the stereo mix, which Atmos was able to unearth so they could be heard clearly. Here you can hear the precise details of what's being played with incredible clarity. As an example, from the pulsating bass rhythm and staccato thrumming on one of my favourite tracks, Day In, Day Out, the sound is so clear that you can almost see Colin, Andy and Dave's subtle fingering as their hands move across their respective fretboards. Similarly, you can hear Terry's precision during the splash of cymbals at the climax of the song. Compared to the 5.1 mix, where the middle of that mix now sounds quite leaden in comparison on my system, it's so easy to pick out the different guitar tracks and vocal parts to the left and to the right of you. By using Atmos, it feels like Stephen has been able to give every one of the multi-tracks a genuine polish that makes the album feel bright, fresh, and new. The overall effect is very different from Wilson's previous Atmos mixes of The Big Express and Skylarking, where those mixes take you deep into imaginary pastoral or industrial landscapes, since the band never intended them to be replicated on stage. As my eldest Caden noted, this Drums and Wires mix places you right in the heart of the Townhouse Studio 2 with the band set up all around you. On tracks like Nigel, you can easily pick out Colin and Andy's vocals separately, but close enough as if they're standing right next to each other, so you can hear how seamlessly their voices blend in the chorus and then separate from the backing. And then how Andy's dub-inspired whooping and refrains of "Steel, Steel" come down to you from the heights. Like on most every mix of the album, Terry's pounding of the drums in the Stone Room is literally rock solid. But what Atmos uniquely does is to pull up that sound into 3 dimensions. For all my claims of realism in this Atmos mix, there are lots of effects and movement in the mix, mostly driven by the sounds of the Korg synthesizer that Andy obviously enjoyed programming. Most apparent is at the end of Helicopter, when Stephen does, as we all hoped and perhaps expected after what he did with the bee in Summer's Cauldron, and takes the whirling copter sound first off behind you, then swirls it back over your head, and then off into the distance. That brought and continues to bring huge beaming smiles of pleasure to the face of your correspondent. I also loved how Stephen has mixed Andy's closing refrain on "When You're Near Me, I Have Difficulty," where he has Andy popping up around you with the vocal "When you're near me," firstly in front of you, then behind you to the left, and then to the right, dressed, in my imagination at least, as the Joker-faced psychiatrist Andy plays in the Nigel video. And of course, the effects on Andy's vocals at the end of Complicated Game are a thing of stunning intensity, and possibly for hardcore Stephen Wilson Atmos mix fans like me, it's probably worth the price of admission alone. Stephen pulls a similar trick to Personal Shopper on his fantastic Atmos mix of his own The Future Bites solo album, in which he takes Elton John's spoken word vocals and fires them back at you from right across the 3D soundstage. Stephen perhaps goes one better here by linking up the compla and cated elements of the frame across the primary colour, pop art, psychedelic vortex he's created that makes you doubt you're in 1980 or even 2025 anymore. Also to note, I really like the way Stephen treated the tambourines in the Eno-esque album extra Over Rusty Water. These tambourines literally beat out a path all around you like some kind of ritualistic shaman, in a similar fashion to what Stephen did on Sacrificial Bonfire, when he placed the snare drum high up above your ears as if you're inside it. Let us not ignore the huge dub influence on this album, which might well have been seeping up through the foundations into the townhouse from its surrounding West London hotbed. You can hear the skanking guitars and trippy spatial effects almost everywhere on this album, from Nigel to Reel by Reel, and That Is the Way to Scissor Man. Colins' excellent bass playing obviously has a key role in this, not least during what Dave Gregory described in 2014's mix's sleeve notes, which are sadly missing from the 2025 edition, along with the videos of the singles, as Colins' ludicrous bass line in Roads Girdle the Globe. Hearing it here in its astonishing glory, one cannot fail to agree. The dub symphony continues amongst the extra tracks delivered in Atmos such as Homo Safari, Bushman President, which seems to feature aspects of Kraftwerk-style synths played on the Korg, Pulsing, and even the lovely quirky breakdown in Sleepyheads. In hindsight, I've come to realise that Andy's fascination with dub was actually my first exposure to this kind of music, and I remember how utterly perplexed I was by the Take Away the Lure of Salvage album after picking it out of an our-price bargain bin. Thanks, Andy. I've actually come to adore dub, though I've never heard the like of your album since. Overall, for me, this new release is a great opportunity to reassess a much-loved and much-listened-to album, as well as his extra tracks, and to hear things afresh and anew. The lovely flugelhorn contribution of Dick Cuthell is even more beautiful on both the usual speed and slowed-down versions of That Is the Way and Officer Blue on the Blu-ray. Finally, I want to say a special word in tribute to the arrival of Mr. Dave Gregory and his contribution to both Drums and Wires and the band thereafter. Listening to his awesome playing, especially now it's so clearly presented on the acoustic and electric guitar multitracks on 10 Feet Tall, you know that the band was intrinsically different from the one that created White Music and Go To. Though you can still hear the remnants of them, of course, on Outside World. Dave's arrival changes the whole DNA of the band and adds perhaps the quality that will make them eternal. You can still sense some of Barry Andrews' influence in the Korg lines, as on Chain of Command, but ultimately the band are an entirely different proposition with infinitely more potential. I think I'll leave the final words of this review to Mr. Gregory, as he sums up the new Atmos mix perfectly when he says in the press release, "The whole album shimmers with a sonic gloss that's brought it to the 21st century with no loss of historic integrity. The songs are as strong today as they were 46 years ago. Immerse yourself, but be prepared for the closing maelstrom that is Complicated Game. You may never recover."
What do you call that noise?
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Hugh Padgham and Mark Fisher.
Hello, hello.
Hi,
Where did that
hi.
voice come from? It was lovely to be introduced from afar. Yes, I'm Mark Fisher, and this is a 4 times Grammy nominee. I think that's deserving a clap of its own. Winner, sorry. I'm already underpraising him.
Yes.
This is Hugh Padgham. I've got to get this right. Engineer on Drums and Wires and Black Sea, and co-producer on English Settlement. But let me just, this is going to be like semaphore to introduce Hugh, because his list of credits is so incredibly vast. Just these are the people that some of the people that he's worked with: The Police, Sting, Phil Collins, Genesis, Peter Gabriel, The Human League, Paul McCartney, McFly, of course, Kate Bush, Julian Cope, Suzanne Vega, Youssou N'Dour, Split Ends, Brian Wilson, and The Waitresses. Chris Butler, being a big XTC fan, who has been on my podcast, if you want to listen back to that. Starting off, graduating from being a tape-op, working with Gentle Giant and Mott the Hoople, and then, of course, XTC and the world on top of that. Hugh, because of the recent news about Brian Wilson, I would quite like to start with Brian Wilson. Very, very sad news of Brian's death. You were the mixer, I think, or final mix on his first solo album. Is that right?
Yes.
What memories do you have of him and his music?
Lots of memories.
Share some of them.
Well, the first day in the studio, I remember he came in and he made this beeline for in the studio in LA. There were these coffee stations, and he obviously wasn't allowed to be on caffeine or anything at the time. And he saw the coffee and he made a beeline for it, and he had a sort of well, we called him the surf Nazi because he was a young kid with blonde hair who was put in by Dr. Landy, who was the famous manager of Brian. And anyway, to cut a long story short, he got to the coffee before the surf Nazi, and then all the coffee had to be taken out of the room. And then, so on the first day, I guess it was, I'm sitting at the console, pushing faders up and down, sort of just checking out what's on the tape of the song. And at the sort of end of the desk on the right-hand side, I had faders for the return of the reverb plate. And so anyway, I'm sitting there minding my own business, and he comes down and sits next to me. And suddenly there's this like, wow, noise come out, and he's taken hold of the reverb faders and pushed them right up to the top. And he said, "Oh, what's that?" But yeah, it was a bit, he was on very heavy medication then. And Stephen Landy basically, was it Stephen Landy? Dr. Landy, we called him. Eugene Landy, that's it. He kind of had Brian as a prisoner in a way. So it was quite sad, and he had to take this medication and stuff. And one day, Russ Teitelman, who was the producer, said to Brian, "Why don't you try not taking your medication today?" And the surf Nazi was there the whole time, and he, unbeknownst to us, then went off and rang Landy and said that Russ Teitelman and me were coercing Brian not to take his medication. It was quite heavy, actually. But there were good times as well. It was actually a good record. But Eugene Landy also had him under control because he wrote the lyrics for some of the songs. And so he wanted, the publishing money from that. But.
And so the way you're talking, this is not a thing you're saying in retrospect. You were conscious at the time of the way that he was being manipulated and controlled.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. But then, from a musical point of view, surely what a joy to be able to have Brian Wilson music coming through all of your channels in front of you. What was that like?
Oh, it was amazing. Yeah, it was really good. And I bumped into the producer by accident. I was in Warner Brothers offices in New York, and I don't know if anybody knows of Russ Teitelman, but he's quite well-known American producer. And I passed his office and I said, "Oh, can I just go in and say hello to him?" So they said, yeah, he happened to be there. And then I went off to my meeting, and towards the end of the meeting, he came along the corridor and just came into the office and said, "Hey, do you fancy mixing the Brian Wilson album I'm doing?" It just happened like that.
Do you get starstruck? I've just listed a lot of very, very famous people there. How do you deal with that on a having met them?
Oh, I don't think I get starstruck anymore. The only one that I was a bit starstruck with to start with was the first time I met Paul McCartney. And I guess I was about 28 or something. And I don't know what he is now. He's about 12 years older than me, so he wasn't even, he wasn't that old then. But, I grew up with the Beatles, like we all did, I guess, And so that was, but after working with him for a year, I certainly wasn't starstruck with him after a year.
But isn't that the thing, that in the day-to-day, yes, in the initial moment you might be a bit heady and lost for words and so on, but the practical business of getting on with making a record means that you can't be starstruck the whole time.
No. I mean, I did, God, how many records? 5 solo records with Phil Collins and 3 with Genesis, I think. And I probably socialized with Phil maybe twice.
As little as that,
Yeah. Well, the thing is, you used to spend all day in the studio, so the last thing you wanted to do is go home and drink coffee or beer or something with them.
With your workmates.
Yeah.
But, I mean, talking about the thing of meeting people, and you were at a very young age, you were at an even younger age when you, I think, first met Steve Lillywhite, and then that brought you towards XTC. I think you were 24 when Drums and Wires was recorded. Talk about the first time and how you came across Steve Lillywhite in the first place.
Well, I worked for Virgin. I joined Virgin Records in 1978, and I'd worked at 2 other quite well-known studios before where I left school at 18 and got a job in a studio called Advision, which doesn't exist anymore. And then I got a job about a year later at a studio called Lansdowne Studios, both in London, which doesn't exist anymore either. Most studios don't exist anymore, sadly. And I got to know people from Virgin Records they had a mobile studio, and they used to go to a friend of mine's house who had it was like a farmyard. It was called the Farmyard. And so I met the Virgin people, and I just thought Virgin was a pretty cool label. They'd obviously had the big hit with Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells, but they had a lot of really cool bands, of which XTC ended up being one of. And anyway, they had a studio in the country called The Manor, and which was near Oxford, which was a really good studio. And then they decided to build a studio in London, which ended up being called the Townhouse. So you had the Manor House and the Townhouse. And so they were looking for more staff, and I got a job there as a sort of, juniorish engineer. And the first record I ever made there was Peter Cook and Dudley Moore. And their third album called Ad Nauseam. So that was quite interesting.
And that was you still as a tape op, was it?
No, that was me as an engineer.
Engineer.
But it was just, them talking. But anyway, soon after that, Steve Lillywhite comes into the studio. He's an independent producer. And he was producing a band called The Members, which had his brother in it as a drummer. And they had 2 quite big hits, I think, called Sounds of the Suburbs and, what was the other one called? Offshore Banking Business. Thank you very much. But as far as I remember, I don't think I would have remembered if I'd done those. So we were obviously doing another song or something. And Steve is exactly the same age. He's exactly 1 month younger than I am. And we just sort of hit it off together. And not long after that would have been the beginning of 79, not long after that, he rang me up or whatever and said, look, I've got the gig of doing XTC, their third album. Do you fancy working with me on it. And so obviously XTC were on Virgin, and I'm Virgin staff, so I don't know what the deal was, but they probably got a good deal being a Virgin artist. And that's how we got to do Drums and Wires. And then after that, a year later, we did Black Sea. And we also, Steve and I, did the other sort of big album we did together was Peter Gabriel's third solo album.
Which Dave Gregory was on, I think, because
he did play on it, yeah.
And I'm intrigued because, as you say, Steve Lillywhite was just a month apart from you in ages, and he'd reached I don't know whether you regard it as a pyramid, but he'd reached the heady heights of producer already at that stage. Was he somebody that was his star burning bright? Were you in awe of him? Had you got ambitions to be a producer at that point?
No, well, not. My kind of original aspiration was really to become chief engineer of a top London studio, I suppose. But it was during my not that long a time at Virgin that I obviously did lots of other sessions with other artists. I mean, Steve was great, but I worked with lots of producers who weren't so great, at least in my opinion. And so I thought, well, one day maybe I could do this producing stuff as well. And so I asked the guy who ran the music side of Virgin Records was a guy called Simon Draper, who was actually a cousin of Richard Branson's. Very nice guy. And I said to him one day, could I have a go at producing one of your junior bands? And when I say junior, I think the first thing I did actually was a single with Barry Andrews, because he had just recently left XTC, obviously before Drums and Wires. And so that's how I sort of, wiggled my way into thinking that producing, could be something that I could do. And then it was really through meeting Phil Colins during the recording with Steve Lillywhite that we were doing on his third album, which is sometimes called Melt. And that's when we sort of discovered this very live, gated drum sound, as they call it. And Phil Colins was the drummer on that. And then a few months after that, he rang up and said, look, I'm going to do a solo album because my wife's left me. I've written all these songs that are no good for Genesis, so I've decided to record them myself. Would you like to produce the album with me? And after that, I never worked with Steve Lillywhite again. In fact, I think many years later, Andy called Steve up again and said, would you and Hugh like to come and do another record? But I can't remember when it was. It was at least 2 or 3 albums later. And so Steve said, yeah, I'd really like to do it. And it's a bit of a distant memory, this, but as far as I remember, he then got fired before we even started because he'd run over doing I don't know what album it was, but he was real busy in those days.
Oh, Kirsty McCall's.
Oh, was it? Okay, it could have. Yeah, maybe it was.
Kirsty McCall's album, who was Steve Lillywhite's wife, wasn't she?
Yeah.
So he obviously wanted to dedicate time to her.
How did you know that?
I read it in the book recently.
Oh, okay. So it's the only time I've ever been fired.
I just have to say, you get better quality heckles in this room than anywhere else.
Yeah. So anyway, we got fired before we were even started. So that was a shame.
But fantastic apprenticeship, even if you didn't realise you were getting it, by that opportunity to watch other producers at work. And you've the negative ones and the positive ones. What do you think the qualities that make a good producer are that you maybe learned at that stage and took with you into the rest of your career?
I think it's a really hard question to answer because there are so many different sorts of producers. When I was sort of starting producing, there weren't so many producers that came out of the actual button twiddling, the engineering side. A lot of producers came from more of a musician's side of things.
And do you have musical skills yourself?
Pretty bad ones in terms of, well, I learnt the piano up to grade 5 when I was young, but and I mean, grade 5's all right, and I can read music because you had to take your music theory exam for that. And then when I was a teenager, I learnt the classical guitar for probably 2 or 3 years, and I then played in a band at school. I played the bass. So, but as soon as I started working in the studios, I realized that it was, because at one point I thought, oh, it'd be great to be a rock musician, bass player in a band. I loved John Paul Jones from Led Zeppelin. So I used to practice playing with Led Zeppelin 1 particularly. And it's such a great album, isn't it? And anyway, as soon as I started working in the studios, I realized, God, what a great idea it was not to follow that up, because I was working with such great musicians from, even when I just started as a tape op, I was lucky to be in good studios. And I think, going back to the producing side, I tend to sort of like to, kind of bond with the artist, find out what they want to do, and try and, do what they're envisaging, rather than somebody. I mean, I have a good friend called Trevor Horn, who's a fantastic producer, but he's much more sort of autocratic, in a word, than me. And I mean, his records, he was almost better known than the artist he was working with. But I mean, he's made some incredible records, which I couldn't possibly make. And I remember bumping into him in the street once in London. I think I was coming out of the dentist, and it was just after Sting's record 10 Summoner's Tales had come out, and it had this song called Fields of Gold on it. And that song is a very, very simple production. And he said, God, I love that song. I could never have produced it. I would have put strings all over it and this, that, and the other. So we were sort of backslapping each other, because I said, well, I could never make a Slave to the Rhythm, Grace Jones. I mean, some of that stuff he did was fantastic.
And do you think, despite that, there might be something that you could call the Padgham sound? Or is it the opposite of that? Is it a question of you becoming invisible to let the artist entirely become forward?
Yeah, I don't think I've got a particular sound, apart from, everybody wanted me because of the gated drum sound. In the 80s.
There's an interesting quote, because we'll talk about drums inevitably, and not least because the first album was called Drums and Wires that we're talking about. But I came across an interview that XTC did in Sounds, and this comes from May 1979, so this was before they'd gone into the studio with you. And this is what Andy Partridge was saying at the time. He said, talking about this album that they were about to start recording, I'd like to get more drumming into things. I think the way drums have been recorded in 99.9% of rock records is that they've been ignored. The producer says, all right, let's make this sound like a drum kit, and that's it. Terry's all for more drums, more, bigger, louder, faster, shaftier, throbbier, thrustier drumming. And what strikes me as interesting is that you've already referred to Phil Collins in The Air Tonight, that sort of drum sound that then defined the sound of considerable chunks of 1980s music, and it was something that you and Steve Lillywhite helped bring out. But I find it quite interesting that XTC were already thinking along the same sort of lines. So did it feel, I'll use the word synchronicity, did it feel like there was some synchronicity in that?
Yeah, well, I think there was, in a way. One of the things about the Townhouse Studios when we started it when I say we started it, when it got built, is that one room, there were two studios. One room was quite sort of conventional. And the second room, we as engineers had sort of meetings, and we decided, this was before it opened actually, because I actually got employed 6 months or more before it opened. And they decided that they were going to have a sort of cheap second studio. And there was a console that had just come out called a Solid State Logic. And it was English, and nobody really had them at that point. And so that was a lot cheaper than the bespoke console that was in the other studio. Anyway, to cut a long story short, we also decided, this was all a load of happy accidents really, we decided that we'd also build a room that was much liver than they tended to be in the 70s. Most rooms were pretty dead, really, and so we just decided it was towards the end of the punk era as well, when there was much more sort of thrashing around, for want of a better word, I suppose. And we thought, well, let's build a room that's quite live. And so the Studio 2 at the Townhouse, it had two areas, one that was sort of deadish, and then the other was live. And we built it with stone all over the walls. And the stone came from the Manor Studios near Oxford. Yeah, and like I said, happy accident. It just happened to, drums sounded really great and loud in it. You know, because when you're standing next to a drum kit and someone's, you know, hammering away at it, it's quite, you know. And so the idea was to try and make records to make the drums sound a bit more live.
And what you're saying about, I've never really thought about this before, but because punk new wave was happening and a lot of new bands emerging and playing in rooms much smaller than this room, was that the sort of thinking to try and get the sound of a scuzzy basement bar somewhere?
Well, sort of, yeah. It was just to kind of give the drums particularly more life. The only drawback on that room was that we used to compress the mics up to make it sort of, I don't know, it's all very technical, but it makes it sound a bit better. But if the drummer hit the cymbals, then the cymbals would be louder than anything else. And cymbals are loud, you know, drummers like hitting cymbals, don't they? In fact, on Peter Gabriel's third album, he came in on the first day and said, I don't want any cymbals or hi-hats on this album. And I actually keep up with Peter. And about a year ago, or maybe 2 years ago, we met for a cup of coffee and had a chat. And I said, did you know that the cymbals weren't, you know, sounded not very or too loud in this room when you came in and said that? He said, no, I really didn't. I just woke up that day and thought, I don't want any cymbals on my record.
Somebody, God told him to do it.
But I have a sort of, going back to this sort of live drum room and sound, do you know a band called Little Feat from the 70s? Well, some of their tracks on some of their records had quite a good live sound on them. And they were recorded by a guy called George Massenburg, who later became a good friend of mine. And I absolutely loved these Little Feat records. And so I had in the corner of my mind an idea of what I kind of wanted the drums to sound like a bit.
And I noticed.
I mean, obviously each song is a different song, but
yeah. But you also worked, I think, with Killing Joke early in your career, and Killing Joke, to my memory, were incredibly drum-heavy band.
Yeah.
And so then it was I'll repeat that word again, synchronicity. It was just good fortune that a band, XTC, came along who were actually interested in the same thing, of exploiting that sound.
Yeah. In fact, I owe Andy for me working with the Police, because they toured with the Police in Australia, I think it was, or the far Australia, wherever. And one day, they were on a bus apparently, and Sting said, "Oh, I really want to get somebody else for our next album. Do you know anybody good?" And Andy mentioned my name, and the next thing I know is the Police's manager rang up. By that time, I had had a manager myself. Mm-hmm. And that's how I got to work with the Police.
Yes, it's amazing how all these things, one thing follows another, isn't it? If you'd set out to work with the Police or set out to work with Phil Collins, it wouldn't have worked. But
no, So it's all being in the right place at the right time, and a bit of luck and a bit of talent, hopefully.
And how much does it make any difference to you is it important for you to like the songs that you're working on? Would you reject a band if you were not impressed with their music, or even a band that you liked that you thought they were under par and so on? So, XTC, a lot of people in this room, all people in this room will tell you that all of those songs on all of those 3 albums that you worked on are fantastic. But is that important to you to get that contribution?
Yeah, it is pretty important. And I have to say, when I worked with Paul McCartney, when he asked me, which is another story, but to make a record with him, and his office sent the demos he had made round to the studio where I was working with whoever, and I was very excited and took them home. It was on a cassette, and played it on my cassette machine at home, and I was really underwhelmed. But I was 28 years old, and I thought to myself, how can Paul McCartney not write a good song? So it must just be the way they've recorded the demos, and I'm sure I'll be able to make something more of it once I've heard them a bit more and all that. And to be honest, I think it's one of his worst records.
And I suppose you have to live with that. I mean, obviously, it's his name on the album sleeve, but you've sort of got to live with that reputation as well. So it's important for you to be recording good quality versions of good quality songs.
Yeah, some of it's all right. I mean, I spoke to a journalist the other day about it, because I'm still asked about everything I did in the 80s especially. And he said, "Oh, I think it's actually quite a good album." And I said, "Well, that's the first time I've heard that." But well, there's a saying that you can't polish a
turd.
But XTC, would never. It is important as a producer that you do like what you're doing. So to put everything you've got to help contribute, make them great. And Andy and Colin. I mean, I still think XTC and Split Enz are probably 2 of the best bands I ever worked with musically, and I mean, obviously the Police were great as well, but for bands that should have been more famous than they were, considering all the talent and everything, XTC. I'm really proud to have done all I did with them.
And you just said that one of the qualities that you like, or that you believe that you do in yourself as a producer, is to bond with the band, find out what it is that they're wanting. As I understood it, you all got on fantastically in the studio and around the studio.
Yeah, it was great. I mean, we had, honestly, Andy is so funny in the studio. I'm sure you all know that from looking at the film earlier and from other things you've read or whatever. We used to have on when we were at the Manor doing English Settlement, we worked 6 days a week. You had to hire the studio by the week, and so we hired it for, I don't know what it was, 6 weeks or whatever it was. But because you hired it by the week, you didn't really want to have any time off because it felt like you were wasting money, and XTC were always sort of rather unlucky when it comes to money. And anyway, we kind of said to ourselves, we're going to have Sundays off. And so we would have, we would lie in on Sunday, and then in the evening or late afternoon, we'd go, well, nothing's happening, so let's go in the studio. And they used to play all these sort of cover songs, like Led Zeppelin covers and Beatles covers, and they all knew the chords for all these songs, and it was absolutely, it was brilliant. But what they would do is they would do a Led Zeppelin cover, but change the lyrics. Andy would just sort of make up lyrics, and we had. I don't know if anybody's English here, you might have remembered a comedian from the 60s called Jimmy Edwards. Do you remember Jimmy Edwards?
Yeah.
But so anyway, we would have they would do a Jimi Hendrix cover song, but call it the Jimmy Edwards Experience. It's hard to explain his humour. And then he would take off all his clothes apart from his underpants, which he would then hitch up round his, his bottom and be a sumo wrestler and dance around the studio pretending to be a sumo wrestler. I mean, honestly, there was never a dull moment in the studio,
and that must make the whole recording process, which I'm sure, particularly from an engineering point of view, there's quite a lot of arduous stuff to do, practical stuff to do. That must make it a lot easier.
Yeah, I mean, we did make the records in very quick time. Mm-hmm. Drums and Wires was made in 4 weeks, I think, from beginning to end, and I don't really remember ever making records quicker than with them. But one of the reasons we were able to do it so quickly is that they were very well rehearsed when they came in the studio. I mean, there wasn't any of this sort of writing lyrics while, we're waiting to record the vocals because he hasn't finished writing the lyrics. I mean, Andy and Colin had everything pretty well rehearsed.
Yeah, and
I mean, obviously we change bits and pieces in the studio because you never know how it's going to sound until you're listening to it back off the tape, so to speak. But excuse me.
And how unusual is that? I mean, you've worked with so many different bands. Is it quite common, that experience you've just described of people finishing the songs off in the studio?
Yeah. I did some stuff with Public Image, and I remember Johnny Rotten going into the studio with a telephone directory because he didn't have any words for one of the songs, and he would just pick out words from the telephone directory. And David Bowie, who I also did a record with, and some other stuff after that, he was famous for cutting words. He'd write words or get them from a newspaper or something, and he'd cut them up and throw them in the air and then put them together when they fell on the floor and try and make stuff from that.
And there is also a legitimate, I think with Bowie's a good example of somebody who's sort of legitimately creating the work in the studio. And as I understand it, that's also the case with Peter Gabriel, is it? That the music comes first and then he does his stuff on top. Is that right? Maybe it's completely wrong. I understood that's how he liked to operate.
I have to ask my friend Dickie up there. But I know there was a famous time when Peter was recording an album at his studio near Bath, and Daniel Lanois was the producer, and I think they locked him in a room, nailed him in the room to try and get him to finish writing lyrics to a song.
So when you're in the opposite of that situation, the XTC arrive, they've been rehearsing in one of the places around here in Swindon, they've been on the road testing these songs. You've got half your work done for you there, I suppose.
Well, yeah, to an extent.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's pretty frustrating to be in a studio when a group or an artist turns up and has no idea what they're going to do. I mean, it's complete waste of money apart from anything else.
Yeah.
But life's so different now because you can buy a laptop for 500 quid and you've got a studio in it, more or less, and back in those days, the only way to make a record was in a studio, and the only way to get into a studio was by getting a recording contract. And because most people weren't rich enough to do that, and XTC were one of those bands, and they signed to Virgin on a pretty bad deal, really, because the Virgin sort of thing in those days was, we'll give you a record contract, but you've got to sign a publishing deal with us as well. And so, if you were young and wanted to get in the studio, you went, yeah, okay, great. And you just wouldn't do that nowadays because your lawyer or your manager just wouldn't let you do it, because the problem that XTC ended up having was that if the two contracts, which should be completely separated, were joined, and if you lost money on one and made money on the other one paid back.
Yeah, so you couldn't win. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to go into all the, but it's one reason why bands struggled in those days, and like I said, nowadays you just wouldn't be allowed to. I mean, it's probably unethical in law now. I don't know, but I mean, the thing with Richard Branson and Virgin was that Richard wasn't that interested in music himself. He just wanted to make money, and we've all know how well he's done that. But it was his cousin Simon Draper who was the one who loved music, and obviously Virgin have a rich history of great acts on the label. But I doubt if you asked Andy or any of the band now if they've got fond memories of Richard Branson. I doubt if they would.
Although elsewhere, people like Simon Draper in Virgin, there did seem, particularly at that period of their career, a huge amount, maybe even a disproportionate amount of love and affection for the band from within the company, that they were prepared to indulge, if that's the right word, XTC and support XTC because they did believe in them, they did like them, and I think...
Yeah, true. I mean, nowadays, if you don't have a hit straight away, you probably chucked off whatever label you're on. But I mean, obviously, the music business is so different nowadays.
Mm-hmm. So you did Drums and Wires, you did Black Sea in your role both times as an engineer. But as we've just been saying, you had an eye to producing. You were starting to and you'd worked with Barry Andrews and so on. How did the relationship change with English Settlement? I mean, what was your role there that felt different?
Well, I guess Steve wasn't there.
The teacher had left the building.
No, we carried on just the same. I think I don't have I have just happy memories from both of those albums, and with Steve, I didn't have a problem with Steve. It was the band's idea, I think, just to ask me to do it and not the two of us. And who knows, when they were wanting to do it, Steve was probably off working with U2 or somebody anyway. So it just sort of morphed into place, and we had a great time as well. And sorry, I'm a bit hoarse for some reason today. But also during these records, I knew the band for, I think it was 4 weeks. We did the first Drums and Wires, 5 weeks Black Sea. I would then go off and do something else, and they would go off and tour for a year or 9 months. And so, we didn't know each other that well, apart from having a good laugh in the studio. So I had no idea that Andy was unhappy about touring, because it never really came up in the studio, because, well, especially on English Settlement, where he really was sort of thinking to himself, because I didn't know about it at all, making the record, that he was not intending to carry on touring with the band.
And I suppose in that sense, you would have been seeing them at their happiest, at their most creative, in their element, really.
Well, I think Terry loved being on the road, which was ultimately probably why he left the band after that. But Andy was definitely happiest in the studio.
What a few of us,
from what I gathered nowadays.
I think that's right. A few of us have been saying over this weekend, when we've just been chatting, how I can't really think of many other bands where every album has its own distinct character and quality that is different from the album before and different from the subsequent album. Did that strike you at the time, that Black Sea wasn't really like Drums and Wires, and English Settlement definitely wasn't like those previous two, the bringing in the acoustic sounds, fretless basses, all of that sort of stuff with English Settlement?
Yeah, for sure.
And also just thematically, the songs, lots of topical issues, social issues that were coming through in the lyrics and so on.
Yeah. And you see you see the band sort of growing up, I mean, I can't really believe that I was only 24 when we made that record, and they can't, I don't know how old they are. About the same age as me?
Yeah, not much older, I don't think. Yeah.
Maybe a year older, or how old's Andy now? 72. Okay, well, I'm 70.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
I mean, the other thing that's unbelievable is this was all like 45 years ago now. I've still got very good memories of it, though.
Yeah, yeah.
But the other thing that comes to mind is that, considering we were in the studio making this record, it was then released, and then you were basically touring the record in those days, and they worked really hard all over the world, really. How they managed to come up with another 12 or 15 really good quality songs less than a year or a year later is unbelievable, I think.
Yeah, really. When did it physically happen?
Yeah. I mean, for instance, David Bowie, who I worked with, he couldn't really write on the road at all. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know when and how Andy and Colin, wrote all these incredible songs.
Yeah, it is quite a mystery, I think.
It just, for me, goes to show how amazing they are or were as a band. Yeah.
Well, Hugh, I'm going to test your memory here, because I told Colin Moulding that I was going to be doing this interview with you today, and whether he might want to ask you anything. And so this is what Colin says. Hello, Hugh. Long time no see. I have much affection for the laughs we had back at the Townhouse all those years ago, where you and Steve Lillywhite would fight it out on the Space Invaders machine, and where the band enjoyed tuna fish sandwiches seemingly on tap, or every whim catered for. Nowadays, my whim is satisfied in a more DIY fashion. But no matter, and so to the question. These days, a musician can enjoy a much prolonged career by playing with their fellow musicians via the internet. But one must learn how to record oneself first. No mean feat with bass guitar, as you know. And this is where you come in. With the gear purchases I have made, I have been extremely fortunate to have acquired the odd piece from the Townhouse itself, though that studio sadly defunct, as we know. Hard to believe that this gear, still good after all these years, may have been handled by your fair hand, Hugh. And here am I using it myself. And who knows, my bass guitar may have even passed through it 40 years before. So I ask, what piece of that townhouse gear would you have deemed indispensable to record Colins' bass guitar back then? I need to know, as I could do with a few tips from the great man himself. Look after yourself, Hugh. Yours with much affection, Colin Moulding.
I know he probably wouldn't say this himself, but I think Colin is one of the most, along with Paul McCartney, is one of the most inventive bass players ever. And when I go back to, I don't often listen to my own stuff, but when I say own stuff, you know, stuff that I've recorded apart from, I just listened over the last 2 or 3 days to the records that, just so in case Mark asked me a question that I wouldn't look too stupid. But Colin's bass playing is absolutely incredible. And the one piece of equipment I think, and I hope he's got, is a compressor called a DBX 160. And I would always put that over his bass. You 90% of the time you probably put a compressor, which is a piece of equipment which makes the loud bits quieter and the quiet bits louder. It's something you use on vocals the whole time as well, because the dynamic range of a voice can be very high, so it sort of pulls it down, so it makes it more audible on a record, for want of a better word. And anyway, this DBX 160 compressor was something I would always use on Colin's bass. So you can tell him to get one of those. But the problem is nowadays, well, not the problem, the great thing nowadays is every bit of equipment that we used 40 years ago is now incredibly diligently and well copied into the digital world. Because of course in those days everything we did was analog pretty well. The tape recorder, everything, you know, reverbs were a big sort of 6 foot by 3 foot metal plate inside a wooden box. And so nowadays, like I said a few minutes ago, you can buy your Apple or whatever computer and buy a set of these plugins, and you've got everything that we had 40 years ago plus more.
And do you have everything? I mean, how do you rate digital compressors compared with the one that you just described?
Well, I was talking to my friend Dickie before, and there are companies that do them better than others, you know, like anything really. How much, you know, the more you pay, the better quality you get. But there isn't really anything that we used in those days that you can't get now. But what Colin was saying as well is that nowadays, because you can send digital files around willy-nilly to anyone, anywhere in the world, and the fact that everything can be adjusted in your computer, you know, you don't even have to sing well, because you can just put what's called auto-tune on it now. And many people, there's probably not that many records that aren't made with it. Sometimes you can use these plugins or whatever to make interesting effects as well. But one of the things that I really notice is that records tend to sound too perfect often, because you can just make everything sound, you can, you know, anything that's wrong, you can just make it right. But in those days when we were making the records, it was like 4 people all playing together in a room, and you'd play it a few times, you know, to get it as well as you could, and you'd probably go back and redo some guitar parts or whatever. But it was the vibe of having people in the same room together playing off each other's feel, whereas nowadays, okay, I can make a record and then send it off to my friend in LA or whatever to put a guitar solo on, which is, great, and it's a lot cheaper, but it doesn't have that vibe and necessarily. And I think Colin was alluding to that just now. So you can't beat having musicians and great musicians at that in a room together.
And you've just very flatteringly compared Colin Moulding with Paul McCartney, and I don't know if you can get a better comparison than that. I know you're also hugely, you have huge admiration for the other musicians, and we started off talking about drums, and so you're talking about musicians working together and having a sort of an organic sound to which those records have, because you were in that analog era. But with Terry Chambers as a sort of digital drum machine of his own, that must have made things a lot easier as well.
I know, I think probably everybody knows that Andy called, Terry the digital drum machine or whatever, human drum machine. I mean, it was amazing because I remember, especially on English Settlement, Andy would come in and say, they obviously rehearsed the songs, but they, changed them around a bit as things happened. And Andy would come in and ask Terry to play the weirdest stuff that is just a normal sort of rock drummer wouldn't think of. And Terry would just go, all right, okay, I'll play that, no problem. And he would just play it, immediately. It was uncanny, actually. He's an absolutely brilliant drummer. Well, they all were. All of them, they're musicians. That's what makes such a good group, really. They're all masters of their own craft.
And I was talking to somebody earlier in the weekend who very shrewdly observed that as a songwriter, and I'm sure this would apply to Colin as much as to Andy, but we were talking about Andy at the time, when you're operating in that band, as a songwriter, you know that, I've got this drummer who'll make that sound. I've got Dave Gregory who'll be able to contribute this element, and I've got this fantastic bass player working with me. And so at the songwriter's disposal were these other musicians, which I think is one of the things that make them a band that stayed together for so long as they did, and established themselves as a distinctive unit that was different from other bands, and those qualities that all of the musicians brought to them to the table was significant to what you then ended up having the privilege of recording. You said having to record. You didn't have to record it. You had the privilege of recording it.
Yes. Yeah.
So, and I'm also impressed. I remember you saying to me once before that you still think that XTC are one of the best bands ever, and we are running out of time, I'm afraid. But of all the bands, and I can just list. I mean, I started off making a list of all the bands you've worked with, but Hugh has worked on particular songs: Synchronicity, Every Breath You Take, No Jacket Required albums as well. But seriously, Another Day in Paradise, 10 Summoner's Tales, If I Ever Lose My Faith in You, Mercury Falling. You've worked on a lot of amazing, very, very successful records, but still, you've taken time out to come, and Hugh will be signing things this afternoon after lunch, taking time out because you still have a huge admiration for this band.
Yeah, no, I do. But I mean, people like Phil Collins, that obviously I did work with Genesis as well, there was a band, but Phil Collins was him solo, and he would just, between him and me, we'd pick who we wanted to come in and play on the record with. So it wasn't really a band, even though he did go out on tour with a band and play, but we didn't really make records like that. Our records were made kind of more or less like overdubs, whereas XTC and obviously I mentioned Split Ends before, were very much, for me, a band. And I, as I think I said before, I think when they didn't want to tour anymore, or when Andy didn't want to tour anymore, that was from Terry's point of view, he didn't want to just be a studio musician.
And
I can see it from both sides, for sure.
Yeah. Well, everybody in this room, I'm sure would love to wish Hugh not just thanks for such a fantastic talk today, but also for being behind such 3 fantastic albums and to be even now dedicated and very fond of those memories. So thank you very much, Hugh Padgham.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for coming to listen to an old fart like me. But I will say I feel extremely privileged to have had the privilege of working with XTC on 3 incredible albums.
Well, we feel privileged for you being privileged for working their privilege as well.
What do you call that noise?
Thanks to Hugh Padgham for being such a great interviewee and for so dedicatedly staying for the very lengthy signing session afterwards. Thanks to all the organisers of the 2025 XTC Fan Festival for their fantastic work. Thanks to Jonathan Jacques for his Drums and Wires review, and to Hick Sasaki for getting it to him. And thanks to Mick Marston for the song. What Do You Call That Noise? The XTC podcast is sponsored by Burning Shed, the online home for all XTC CD, vinyl and official merchandise. And thank you as ever to the many generous podcast supporters on Patreon, who include the following Knights in Shining Karma: Terry Arnett, Kevin Burt, Lorenzo Charchi, Cale Corbett, Liam Duggan, Jamie Dunn, Alison Eels, Jeff Farris, Mike Grafe, Robert Graham, Camille Henry, Stephen Hope, Alan Hughes, Rick James, Peter Kitchen, Marek Kraus, Jesper Kumberg, Robert Lawlaw, Adrian Loon, Liz Lynch, Murray Meikle, Yusef Murrah, Max Nyaho, Amy Parkinson, Tim Parsons, Gail Ramage, Mark Reed, James Reimer, Jaime Rostamora, Michael Sutcliffe, Steve Swift, Mark Thomas, Nigel Waller, John Wedemeyer, Lucy Verbitsky and Martin Whitley. And that is all for now. We'll be back again with more 2025 Fan Festival goodness next time.